Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is one of Rice Creek Associates reflection talk. Also, welcome to Emeritus Professor Seago. He is a developmental biology or plant developmental biology biologist and specialty wetlands. So he will tell us about plants adaptation to water and wetlands.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about plant adaptations to waters and wetlands. Waters meaning plants that grow mostly in aquatic situations like lakes or rivers, as well as wetlands with more accessible muddy bottoms, so to speak. Okay, and I want to note that one of the things I'm going to do here today, and probably bore the heck out of some of you, but I'm going to try to give you some background in some parts of the plants that really are what help make them adaptable to wetland and aquatic conditions, which is not what you usually get talked about. Okay, and so I'll be getting into that, and then I'll finish up with a bit about migrations. Quite a bit about migrations, but I'm going to emphasize some things and then de-emphasize others. We'll see how it goes. I want to note though that I've had a lot of help during all my career from a lot of people. And so I always start off any talk I give with my acknowledgments and thanks to the people who helped me, starting with my wife, Marilyn, here, and all these other people. Yes, starting off and the institutions, including Rice Creek Associates, for having me here today. Plus SUNY Oswego, and I've done quite a bit of my work at other institutions in Europe and in China. And I even have done some of the work that I'm reporting today there when they've had plants that are the same ones that we have here, okay, in addition to other things. And so I want to get into some of this with you, okay? And I want to start off with this. Here are a lot of the things that I've worked with over the years, in the situations in which I've worked. But I want to start off with the first two images, which are given to me by the late Carl Allen. Did any of you know Carl Allen of Minetto? He's been dead now a few years, but he was born in about 1924 or 5 or something like that. Now, by the way, I was not around in 1895, okay? And these are images that he gave to me, plus some others. And at that time, there were very few plants growing in the edges of the river here then. And you'll notice no highway along the edge of the river, no discernible highway along the edge of the river. Now that's changed. And of course, up in the upper right there would be what's now Route 48 going south through Minetto. Okay? And on the other side of that, top part of that highway there is this thing here called the dugout. Most of you are probably familiar with the dugout, the pond in Minetto that's on the other side of Route 48 from the river. Okay? And I'll be getting into that plant quite a bit. Okay? In addition to that, south of there, near Fulton, is an inlet that goes out to the Oswego River there. And of course, the county recycling center, et cetera, is over here. Okay? Garbage center and stuff. Then this is the glimmerglass on campus pond, which has an inlet and outlet. This is part of the Oswego River after some of the infamous water chestnut has grown on it. And I'll be dealing with that to some depth, actually. Here's a cattail marsh in west of Fairhaven near Wolcott on Broadway Road. Any of you know that? Okay. And it's a huge set of marshes there, been divided by roads and things. This cattail marsh probably wasn't like that in the 1700s, because the plant that dominates that is one that is a hybrid between the native one and presumably invasive one, okay, that started dominating the marsh in the 1800s. Okay. This is the same place a little bit further to the right here in winter, which Marilyn took this picture of me trying to work on the cattails in the winter. Actually, that's a good time to work on wetlands around here, when we have a decent winter. And by decent winter, I mean plenty of cold and plenty of snow. Okay. In other words, this last winter was very disappointing. And so have been about 5 of the recent ones. Those mild winters are horrendous on our native plants. Okay. Here is a major wetland area this road is Snake Swamp Road. So this is on the other side of the road. Look on the other side of the road from Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario would be out here in front of you. Down here is out here in Rice Creek. This is the pond in the Fairhaven area. This is a roadside ditch. And this is an image of two plants I'll be talking about here, the water chestnut and the water willow. And this is taken behind the dock in the town of Minetto. Okay, right along the shoreline there. Okay. Now, I also want to mention this. This just came out this spring, just in May, in fact, in this issue of International Journal of Plant Sciences. And this is an article by Teresa Cully and Zipporah Feldman on native and invasive plants. I'm not sure I can find it right away, but it's in here. And what they've done is tried to define things according to the Horticultural Society, so that native plants are something which are supposed to be normal to an area. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what's normal and native to an area toward the end. And guess who I'm going to bring up when I talk about that? An old guy named Charlie Darwin. Okay. And also invasive plants. And here they define invasive plants as only those kinds of plants which do harm to the economy or to the environment or to plant, animal, etc. species. Okay. And I actually disagree with that a little bit, as you'll probably see when I go through things. Now, down in the lower right, I kept it small on purpose, is a little abstract of a talk I gave in 1971. And we started this work in 1970. And my co-authors were Connie Chesla, who was a biology major studying under Lee Marsh at that time, and he's the third author on this, and a native of Oswego. Now, I don't know where she is now, but Connie Chesla helped get me into wetland plants shortly after I got here. Okay, then I gave a talk on it a year later in Edmonton, Alberta, and it was on purple loosestrife. Now, strangely enough, I'm not going to be dealing with purple loosestrife today. I've worked on scores to hundreds of aquatic and wetland plants, and I'm only going to cover several, and you ought to thank me for that. So I'll try not to keep you here for 3 or 4 hours. We'll try to make it end by about 3 o'clock if I can. Okay. At any rate, that's the abstract of the talk that we gave, that I was actually the one that gave in Edmonton, Alberta. Now, I got to give you some background. And so I'm going to have about 3 slides of background here, okay, to show you, because part of the sequence of things I'm going to cover is related to this. And this is what we call a phylogenetic scheme, or almost a tree. And it starts off with the plants that are presumably most likely ancestors of the flowering plants, which we call the angiosperms. Okay. And the earliest angiosperms were presumed to have been a thing called Ambrella up here, which is a tree or shrub-like thing from the Southwest Pacific Islands. And the Nymphea, water lilies. Well, that's quite a bit of difference. Little shrub or tree versus the water plant. Well, for a long time, we thought all the ancestors to the flowering plants were like magnolias, which is the next group here. Now we know that they weren't. They were this, most people think this plant. However, there are some people who believe that some of the first flowering plants around were the water lily types. And I'm going to show you an illustration of that. Then, whoops. Okay. Then I'm going to cover this group of plant, which we call the monocots, which are the grasses, orchids, things like that. And the reason I'm going to do that is I want to cover this thing called sweet flag here, because its ancestors are presumed to have been among the first of this whole big group of plants. And this is the group of plants, although there are fewer groups of plants here with their scientific names than here. Okay, but this is the group of plants that has the most aquatic and wetland plants in it. And I've got quite a few of them listed here that I'll cover. Some of them briefly, others in a little bit of depth. And then this is the group called the dicots, or eudicots. And in this particular case, I'm only covering about 6 of them here, or 7. But the very first one is a thing called Stratophyllum, or hornwort, or coonwort. Coonwort for raccoon wort. And that's presumed to be one of the first ones that ever evolved, that gave rise, whose ancestors helped give rise to the rest of these flowering plants. Okay, so it's a neat group of plants. Now I got to use some background, so bear with me for a minute, or 5 minutes. Okay. There are two major things that help, two major structural features of plants that help them be adapted to waters and wetlands. And they're mostly underwater. And so they're mostly with the roots or with the stems that are under the water. And that's not what you hear much about, but that's what I've done. And you asked me to come and talk, and so this is what I'm going to talk a little bit. And so let me start off by saying this is sort of what a root could look like. Okay. In fact, that's one of the roots from these wetland plants. That's I think there. I will put that down. Okay. It's just a normal root growing up. This is the tip of it. In fact, at the tip is where a lot of plants can take out water and minerals, right at the tip, but they don't do it that way that much. They take it up a little bit behind that. Okay. This is what a root would look like if you were in a high school biology class or a college biology class. And then this is the thing I get in trouble with colleagues, is an illustration of how water and minerals are taken up by a plant. Okay. Now we learn in high school and college biology that water and minerals are taken up by the root hairs of the epidermis of roots. And the water and minerals go through the cytoplasm into the cortex, which is part of the epidermis. They go into the cortex, which is the next group of cells under there, into where the conducting tissues are. One set of them, xylem, conducts water and minerals up, and the phloem, food materials down, plus a few other things. Okay. Well, that's not really what happens. And yet that's still propagated in college biology classes. Water and minerals actually go in through the cell wall, and the cell wall is a non-living part of a plant cell. The living part is the protoplasm, made up of nucleus and cytoplasm. It has a membrane around it. But it turns out things like calcium and all the other minerals go up through the cell wall. They go through the cell wall here, and here, and here, and here. And they go all the way through cell walls, not through the cells, until they get into the innermost layer of the cortex, which is called an endodermis. And that's here and shown here. These are unfortunately my drawings. Okay. And here they have around them a strip that goes around the cell. Most cells are rounder rather than like that. It goes around the cell just like a band or a ring. Okay. And it's a layer of lignin, which is the same substance that wood is made out of. Wood is hard because of lignin. And it goes around the cell like that, and it binds the cell wall to the membrane of the protoplasm. That binding forces water and minerals through the cell, through the cytoplasm. And that's actually the first time water and minerals get into a cell when they enter a plant root. So we call this a barrier layer because it can get thick walled. This is what it looks like in an ultraviolet view here. That's my drawing. But then it develops a little layer around the side of cell wall out of suberin, a lipid material. And lipids are hydrophobic. They don't like to let water pass through them. Okay. Well, they develop that there. A lot of wetland plants go a step farther. They develop a layer in the outer part of the cortex, the outermost layer right under the epidermis, where they produce the same kind of structure. We call that a Casparian band here, but it's broader, made out of lignin. And then at the same time, they produce a suberin layer, like right there, right outside the protoplasm, laying against the wall and attached to the band of lignin. That cuts off everything. Cuts off water and minerals from going in, but it also cuts off air, oxygen from going out. And that's one of the things roots can do for aquatic and wetland plants. That is, they can let oxygen out of them into the rhizosphere, or the environment around the root, which can help other kinds of organisms. Okay. So that's the first part of my story. Okay. The next part is this. They also produce air spaces. They produce air spaces typically a lot more than plant roots and sometimes stems than the plants that grow in terrestrial conditions, like right here. And these air spaces take different forms. Well, this is my water lily example. I'm going to get back to that in the next slide. But this is my water lily example. And this is a water lily root. And look, these air spaces, I don't know if you can see that or not. The other one down here, look, they look like a honeycomb. They've been nicknamed honeycomb air spaces. Now, what does that do? That means when the root is like this, air could go from above the water, through the leaves, down the stem, if there's a stem, into these roots, and they help the roots grow. It gives the roots the oxygen they need for growth. Plus, they can leak out of there some if they don't have those layers on that stop the leakage. So that's major. This is just filled with air spaces. Okay, very distinctive honeycomb appearance. Or they can't, whoops, pardon me. Or cells can just separate like this. They separate like that. And when they separate a little bit, they create spaces. And so once again, air can go that same set of channels, but not nearly as efficient. There are a lot of living cells in here, but this one has very thick cells out here and very thick cells right there. And at this stage, this root can't lose much oxygen out of it, nor take water and minerals or oxygen into it if it could get oxygen into it. Yeah. And it gets blocked in here.
It's a touch screen. Don't touch the screen, honey.
I didn't touch this, I didn't think.
No, the screen itself is the touch.
Oh, the screen?
Yeah.
Is sensitive? Okay. And by the way, these are some of the plants associated with it here. You notice this is the cattail. And here, these are spaces in which cells die, but they die along a radius. Out from the center of the root, out to the edge. And not all the cells can die. If they all died, we'd be anything to support the rest of the tissue of the root. Okay. But they're there. And so these die in this pattern. They're radio spaces, if you will. Okay. Or they can die with tangential or circumferential spaces like this. And as you're going to see, this is very characteristic of one group of plants. And I don't know if my specimens that I brought in today will show or not, but you can actually feel the difference in these roots with this kind of a pattern. So these cells die, and they leave some living cells this way to support it. And they have great channels for oxygen to go from above water to below water. They can go out through the tip of the roots, or before these other burial layers were formed, they can go out through them. Now, let me get into this. Let me start with the water lilies. Okay, they're at the bottom of my scheme. In other words, they're like similar to some of the first flowering plants that lived on Earth in the water. This is from the dugout in Minetta. Okay, it's a great lake. By the way, I tried to go out and get some yesterday, and the only way I could have gotten them would have been to fall in, and Maryland wouldn't let me fall in. Yeah,
Do they call it a dugout because it was a man-made?
yes, yeah. And I don't remember what year the highway was, first dirt highway was put in, but it was after the image that I showed you up there first. Anyway, look at the, I don't know if you can see this or not down here, but a lot of these plants have a little underwater stem, but the stem is buried in the muck and the mud. And by the way, that mud can be 2 to 5 feet under the water surface, but it can also be 1 to 3 feet thick. So had I gone in there yesterday, I probably wouldn't be here. Okay. Anyway, it has a little thing down here, and we call those stems when they're buried like that and run more or less horizontal. They don't always have to rhizomes. And that name is right here. Okay, rhizome. It's an underground underwater stem. But when I mean underwater for rhizome, I mean buried in the muck, in the mud. Now, I want to give a few examples of it. Look at the kind of root tissue that it has. It has that with these honeycomb type spaces in it. Okay. So down here, buried in the water, or these roots with that, that's where they get their water and minerals, even though they're immersed in water and minerals. They don't get it very much from the stem. This is a piece of the root. The other thing that the root has in it, which is genius on the part of water lilies, they have these little woody type cells We call them astrosclerides, or star-like thickened cells, which are like wood. They're literally made out of xylem and dead at maturity, and they're woody. Now, look at how sharp edges those things have on them. Can you imagine being an underwater critter and trying to eat that root? Or the stem, this is a stem, this is the hollow, this is the airspace in it, and these are clusters, massive clusters of these cells, dead cells. And this is the petiole to the leaf coming up here, because the petiole starts way down here in the mud, and the flower stalk too. That's a petiole. Look at those huge air spaces. These things are adapted to this water condition because of these air spaces and the barrier layers around them, which prevent an exchange of materials here when they may need them. These are the sclerites. This is one very complex one. Here are a couple of very simple ones. No wonder they've been around for about 135 million years. Okay. Now, you notice the, oh, one last thing over here. Elsa Marie Friss, a Dane, has shown us that probably the first flowering plant fossil that's confirmed to be a flowering plant is an aquatic plant, not a tree or a shrub, but an aquatic plant. Well, a lot of people don't like that. They want these trees to be the ancestors of flowering plants. But she has shown us that this is characteristic. The leaves are a little bit different, but there are some water lily leaves that are a little bit longer that they are round like this. Okay. She and her colleagues have shown that. So this plant is in effect probably very similar to the earliest ancestors of flowering plants. Now, we don't know what the insides of this look like because they can't get adequate fossils to examine the insides of them. Okay. Now I'm going to go up through the Monica. This is sweet flag. We can find this around here. I found this around here. Okay. And this has the same kind of rhizome. This time I'm focusing on the underground, underwater stem here. They're usually thick little things, about the size of your little finger or big finger. They vary. Okay. And they have roots coming off of them. They go down. Some of them can be very deep. Okay. And then what they send up is usually mostly leaf material, except for the flowering stalk. Okay. So they have to be adapted to that situation. However, they don't grow usually in deep water like the water lily does. They will grow more along the shore. Now, in their roots, guess what? They have air spaces just like the water lilies. And they develop just like the water lilies. Okay? But they don't have those cells in them that would be tough for organisms to chew on. But they do have barrier layers here and here, which control what gets in and also what gets out, like the air. The rhizome has the same kind of structure, but it doesn't have quite the same kind of air spaces in it, even up into the leaf. They have these barrier layers around the cells that conduct the water and minerals and the sugars. And if you want to interrupt me, please feel free. Okay. Now, as I go up through some of these monocot types, you'll notice one of the things in common for the first few of them is that they all have these rhizomes that are buried in the muck of the mud. Okay, many of them right along the shore, or actually out of the water along the shore, but they all have the same kind of thing too. And this is neat. Now, well, this is the one I had in the picture. I only show this with the stem to show that it has a barrier layer in it, just like the stems of the water lilies underground. Okay. The roots are the same way. Okay. Here's a yellow sweet flag, you know, is iris. Okay. And of course, this is just in Minetto. The other ones were from other places in the county or in Cayuga. Okay. This is the yellow sweet flag iris, and its roots are like this. Okay, you can't see the air spaces in here very well, but you can see they have these big barrier layers here. And when they get barrier layers like this, nothing can pass through either way. However, they don't have to worry about that because they send air down through here. And they can go all the way to the root tip where it can leak out before the barrier layer is completely formed, or on the outside, or it can leak out through the tip, which can help the organisms that live around The stem is the same way, just like the previous stem. Okay, it has a very thin cortex layer, which is tissue that is soft tissue usually, but it has a barrier layer right here, which is shown like this, plus a layer on the outside, just under the epidermis, that keeps things from getting in and getting out once they get a certain age. The flower stalk is a little more complex. It does not have such barrier layers, and you notice it doesn't even have much in the way of air spaces in it. And yet that's where some of the air has to go from there down, usually through the leaves. Okay. Now, this is one place I've worked in a lot over the last 40 some odd years. This is the cattail marsh. This particular one is just west of Fairhaven. And this is extensive. This goes on for dozens and hundreds of acres. In and out, in and out. I don't know what it was like before the road was built through it. You know, Broadway Road in Wolcott and Fairhaven. I know you do because you had to be there. Part of that picture in the snow. Okay. Anyway, cattails are built the same way as these other plants, except they're far more numerous. And they have long, narrow stalks, just like some of the other ones, not the water lily. And they have a rhizome down here, which is interconnects. And so the stems and leaves come up like this. Now, however, most of what you see here in a cattail marsh is leaf. They produce very little stem that branches up from the rhizome. There's very little upright stem. Okay? And the roots have quite a bit of airspace tissue in them, but not like the water lilies do. But they have good airspace, but they also have great barrier layers here and here. Once they get mature, nothing much can go out or in. It's a good mechanism for allowing them to grow effectively. And here's the rhizome of it. Has the same thing, except smaller air spaces in it. And here's a leaf. Now, this picture was taken by Hilary McManus, graduated from Seago in 1998. She's now a professor at Knox College. And this is what a leaf looks like. It's just filled with huge air spaces. So these things take in air and shunt them down through here into there where the roots can grow. And they really do grow and they spread. Now, this is a hybrid. Now, a lot of people call this an invasive plant. And I have two over the years. But it's a cross between the native plant, the broadleaf cattail, and the narrowleaf cattail. And so if it originated here, what would you call it? Think back to the definition earlier by Cully and Feldman about plants that originate someplace are called native. Okay. That's where these things apparently originated. Now, I wasn't here at that time, but I think they originated about in the 1800s, early 1800s. So this is a major marsh with thousands of acres in New York State. Now, this plant is so successful because it outcompetes its parents completely, and yet it doesn't reproduce sexually by its flowers very much. Probably less than 1% of the time. It's basically sterile, but it doesn't have to worry because it keeps reproducing this way without having to go through sex. We call it vegetative reproduction. And it just keeps spreading. And because of these situations here with this, and this, it's able to adapt to changing levels of water. Okay, so this can go down to its rhizome, where the roots are almost exposed, and cover up the depth of the water can get up to here. 2/3, 3/4 of the way up the plant of the leaves. These are all just leaves, right? Extending up from under the water. Very neat competitor for other organisms. Okay, now a couple more like this. This is a common rush from around here. I don't remember where I got this, either Plymouth Glass or one of the marshes in Cayuga County. And it too has a root. Its root looks just like the other things. And these big barrier layers with those big air spaces go along the radii. Okay? In the rhizome, here's the rhizome underwater one, where it has big air spaces that are a lot like the root air spaces, but it also has the barrier layer in here. There it is, which restricts the movement of water and minerals in because who cares? Rhizomes aren't supposed to take up water minutes anyway. And air out, but they don't have to worry about it because the air is going down through here. Okay, now when you come up to the part of the stem that rises above the water, and these are stems. A lot of people call them leaves, but they're stems. And the stem is shaped like this below water, with a huge hollow center to it. Well, you don't have to worry about air much, do you? Because it's got a huge channel for air to go through. Then when you get up higher in the stem, above the water, then you find more scattered, broken up spaces. Now for the problem children. These are the sedges. I put the family name up here because they're in this family called Cyperaceae. They're in with the total grass group because they all look like grasses. So did the previous one. Previous one looked like this. In fact, the previous one used to be classified with these things. But I want to show you these to show you some differences amongst things. Okay. The sedges are oftentimes described as having triangular stems. Well, guess what? I've got a good one here, the American bullrush. It's a little bit concave here, but that's good. And it's all the way up and down. The whole stem that's above, in the water and above the water. Okay. Whereas the spike brush is oval up near the tip and more roundish with a couple of indentations partway down. This is one of the ones that's found around here. And then the umbrella palm, which I've got examples of these three here. I'm going to show you that, which is sort of triangular here, but bulging out in each of the faces. But you go down the stem below that, partway down the stem, or even above this, where the leaves come out, the blades come out, and it's round. So they're not all triangular at all. Okay. And they do have rhizomes, but their rhizomes are not quite the large horizontal ones that you find in most of these other groups like this. They tend to be a little more vertical and much shorter. They spread. They can divide and spread. And you have roots coming off of them and these coming up out of them. Okay, so this is this first one, this is the second one, and this is the third one. And you notice here are the leaf blades way up here, and here are some flowers up there. Now, what sets these plants apart, though, from all others in the flowering plant world is their roots. And while the roots haven't been studied that much, there are thousands of species of these things, thousands of them. While the roots haven't been studied that much, one of the neat things that the roots have is almost all the ones that have been studied have this circumferential or tangential cell death. Here, 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 and two others that I'm not showing pictures of, here and here. They're all characterized by that. And oops, I'm going to pass some of these around. This is the first one. And if you take a feel of a root, a little white stuff out and push it a little bit, it will ruin them. And I'm not so sure it shows it here, but you can feel how soft, because when they're young, before they form this thick layer on the outside, they're with this tangential or circumferential depth, they're softer than all the other roots. You can feel the stem. You can feel that it has sort of a triangularity to it, but that's about it. Now the next one, and I had to buy this, couldn't find it, is this Eliocharis, or spike brush, giant hairgrass. Okay, and the roots are hard to come by, but its stems are round, unlike the others. There. And finally, something which is supposed to be characteristic of the whole group is this last one called the American bulrush. And here you can really feel the triangularity of it. You will get that and pass it around, please. And if there are any roots on there that you can feel, try to squeeze them a little bit to see if they're a little bit soft and mushy. Okay. I just took them out of the water this morning. So that makes them very unusual. This group is different from all the rest of the groups because of this characteristic of the root. Now, there's been a lot of studies of these roots over the decades, over the centuries, pardon me, since about 1850, that a lot of the early ones weren't able to examine the roots well when they were mature. So we don't really know what they were like. But all the ones we've examined recently have had this kind of structure, which makes them very unique. It's a much more characteristic structure than the triangularity of the stems, which is what people usually use. Okay, now a plant you're probably more familiar with, Phragmites. Okay, the common reed grass growing along roadside ditches and things like that around here. You familiar with those? I mean, you can't miss these things. Okay. Now, one of the neat things about this is the bottom of this shows their roots, and the roots have a lot of this airspace tissue in them and a lot of the barriers, and that helps them adapt to the situation because they can get flooded. Okay. They get flooded quite regularly, like probably today for a while. Okay, but what's neat about them is, in this other picture on the left, is of their stems or rhizomes, the underground part. They do produce, these stems look just like this when they grow up erect too. Well, the neat thing about these things is they don't have these barrier layers in them, but they have a huge central part, which is a hollow area, plus big air spaces. Now, I have friends in the Czech Republic and in England who studied this a lot, and they've never been able to demonstrate these barrier layers in these stems. So they've now figured out that it's this blockade of air tissue, which is preventing them from getting adversely affected by changes in their water condition, whether when they're submerged a little bit, the lower part of them are submerged or not. So it's pretty neat. Okay, now, that's not the only way this group of plants has stems. We have some that are floaters. And this is a little floater that's I took from a marsh west of Wolcott. Okay. And this is called European frogbeck, which is a nasty little invasive. You're familiar with invasive, I'll get to in a few minutes. Okay. But this is what we call, instead of a rhizome, we call it a stolon, S-T-O-L-O-N, because it floats along the water or just under the surface of the water. It's not buried in the muck. And from it come leaves and roots like this. And the roots have this internal barrier layer, which I call it endodermis, but not much on the outside. Its stems have the same kind of thing there. Here inside. And the only kind of barrier it has on the outside to uptake of water and minerals, or the loss of air, is the cuticle on the epidermis. And the cuticle is just like your waxy cuticle. It's a wax layer, and it doesn't let air go through it very easily, or water or minerals, certainly not minerals. It can let water and air go through a little bit because it has little tiny micropores in it, but they're so very tiny, it can't allow much to go through it. Okay, now I'll end up my part with the monocots with this. This is a floating, completely underwater, completely submerged. These are the water nymphs or the guppy grasses. Here. And I got these slides from Sherry Chase. Any of you remember Sherry Chase? He was here. He came with me in 1968, and he retired in 1981. He's one of the world's foremost, if not most foremost, agriculturalists there's ever been, including more important than Norman Borlaug, because he revolutionized plant breeding. But there's a PhD at Cornell University. He worked on this strange little aquatic called Nias, or little water nymph. And he gave me these specimens many years ago, many decades ago. Okay? And it has a little bitty endodermis in here with these barrier layers in here in the stem, with air spaces. Not much to block air movement in and out of this, except in this one, guppy grass, where as it gets older, it produces this cuticle, and that waxy layer stops stuff from going back and forth. So it doesn't oxygenate the water as much. Okay. But it can through any cut edges that it has on it. Okay. It does have roots. It does have roots, but they're very, very simple. Now, when I contrast this and think back to the sweet flag that I had earlier with this thing, serrata phyllum or coontail or hornet, which I mentioned earlier. This plant is supposedly at the base of the origin of all the dicots of the world. And some kinds of its fossils have been found. Okay? But what's neat about it is, it has these stems and leaves, but it has no roots by which it can take up or exclude water and minerals and air. Here's an example of it, but it has these air spaces, which are very much like, on a simpler scale, the sweet flag and the water lily. So at the base of the three major lines of flowering plants, what I'll call the Amarillo water lily line, the monocot, grasses and orchids, I'm not mentioning orchids, because they're usually terrestrial or aerial, not always regional. And the dicots, you know, buttercups, legumes, sunflowers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. It has these air spaces in them which develop just like the air spaces of the sweet flag or the water lily. So they're adapted to that in some similar way, except they have no roots. And they've apparently survived for about 115 to 120 million years. Now, not this species, but they apparently survived successfully that way. Whether they had roots originally or not, I don't know, because the fossils don't show that. Let me go on to others. Another one would be the buttercups. This comes from right down this trail, right here, one of these trails, the lower trail here. I took this little buttercup from down there, and this was taken a few years ago. Now, the only thing I'm going to show here is that it has some airspace tissue in its stems that are underground, and it also has the barriers under the conducting tissue, water mineral conducting tissue, or you can't see it here, but the sugar conducting tissue has those same kind of barriers, just like other wetland plants. Now, here's the story. You're all familiar with this. This, of course, is water chestnut in the Oswego River. This image is taken, and all these images are taken right from the little piece of land if you go across from the Minetto Drive-In Theater. Okay, and walk down that little sandy slope there. That's where I get these materials and do the work. This is what this river looks like in early summer, like a couple weeks ago, like right here. There are a few little plants right there. Okay, then in June, it'll typically start looking like this. They spread extremely rapidly. They're pretty efficient in what they do. Okay, then by August, they're piling up on one another here in this same area. They're piling up on one another. And then this is a few years ago after the August Roundup spray. You remember that? Anybody? Okay. I'm going to have to show this to the Drosses somehow. Okay. But anyway, here's what plants can look like when you take them out of the water. And what happens is they're fruits, and they have one seed in the fruits, and little points on them. And you can see here when they get older, at the age. They're very sharp. You don't walk in this water barefooted, because if you walk in this water barefooted, you step on these things, they'll go through, what do you call them? Beach stalks. Okay. They'll really go through that. But anyway, this is what they look like, and they have a stem that comes up from there, lots of roots that come off the stem at various points, and then the leaves that come off that look like that. Okay, and as the seeds mature up above the plant up here, they fall, they descend through the water, they land in the substrate below them, not where the river's flowing fast for sure, and they age and they become actually impermeable to about everything. And they can live for 11 to 15 years in the water, in the mud over there like that. So all these people who are going out and stripping the water from these plants usually do it in July or August. they've already flowered. They've already sent their fruits, their seeds down underwater. They've sunk the bottom of the water. And once they sink down there, they're broken off from their stem, and they get immersed in the water, and they can be there for 1 to 15 years. And so this kind of spray didn't do a damn thing for that water river. Not one thing, except put Roundup in the water. Now, some of the features of this. These things have these air spaces in the roots. They have the barriers in them. Okay. So the air can get down there to where it's needed. And the water and minerals can come in before this one is formed on the outside, and come in, go through the cortex of this into the xylem and conduct it up the plant. Okay. And the sugars can come down. Sugars are mostly needed down near the tip of the root. They have a rhizome a stem, a stolon, because it's not embedded in the water. It comes out through the water and then close around the top of the water. That's what they look like. They have these huge air spaces in them, but they too have barrier layers in them that prevent the movement of substances once they mature. Okay, so it's a very effective way to get air down the plant, and of course he can go up, and of course water and minerals up, and the sugars down. And this is what it looks like when it goes up into a leaf. And here's a leaf with these huge air spaces in it, not too unlike a cattail or a water lily. Okay? But this is the key. This fruit, it's a one-seeded fruit, and that gets under there, and you don't know it's there, and it's hard to remove. That's one of the reasons it's so successful. And its structure is so filled with combinations of polyphenols and lipids that nothing can get in or out of it very easily until it's ready to germinate. Now, going near it, right along the Oswego River, and these were taken at the boulders along the pier in Minetto. You're familiar with the little riverfront park in Minetto? Okay, these are taken along that. This is the water willow, and this grows neatly, and it has roots that are similar to the other kinds of things I've shown you. Okay, here it is with that rhizome that goes along the surface of the sand under there. Then it sends stems up. Now, the neat thing about the stems that come up is that when the stems are underwater, they have barrier layers to them, and not much in the way of airspace tissue. But above the water, they don't have any of these things. So these things are adaptable depending on the conditions they're in, which makes them really pretty cool. Now, a couple more. This is the floating heart. I got this from, again, Cayuga and Wayne counties, okay, many years ago. And what I'm going to point out to you here is, look what's in the root and in the stems. The same kinds of cells, dead cells, that were in the water lily, that make them difficult to chew on if you're a creature. Okay, so they don't get eaten very well. They're a great invasive plant because they're so resistant to critters eating them. Okay? But the interesting thing is their air spaces aren't at all like the water lilies, but the production of that thing is, and that's why they've been given the scientific name nymphoides. Nymphoides, little water lilies. Okay? Now they're way up the evolutionary tree from the water lilies. Okay, then right in Minetto itself, as you can see the fire station there in this little stream that goes out to the Oswego River, is this little plant, okay, watercress. Here it is, and here's one taken out with the stem and roots. Okay, and here it is in winter. This thing is really good. Look at it in winter. It's floating and still living. Okay. And why? Well, it has those same kinds of characteristics the others have, just slight variations on it here. But here, the big airspace in the stem, which is mostly underwater, is a hollow stem in the center. Big hollow stem. And the stem's not very big, but this airspace is hollow. Really makes it adaptable to these waters. So it's the root where things are taken up, but the passageway is in these stems. And that's its adaptation to it. Now, I'm finished with what seems like a ridiculous thing. Okay. P. I'm not sure I can get these all out. The plant part of it is almost finished here. Could you hand or throw these around, please?
Mhm.
You can't get that one off the paper. There we go. There's another one out here. And touch the root. You notice how much firmer it is, or it should be. Okay. This is typical pea plant. Now, why would I bring a pea plant into this? When do these peas, especially snow peas, grow? Spring. When? In Oswego County, New York, what is spring like? Normally, we hope. Snow is melting, the ground saturated, the rains are here, the ground saturated. And so it turns out it's not just the roots. This is a general biology kind of image here, which also has nodules in it, which have rhizobium bacteria in it, and that's what they're famous for. Okay. But the stems have the lower part of the stems, the parts of the stems that grow right at the soil surface where the water is and it's melting, have this very rare endodermis in it. Well, in legumes aren't supposed to have that. But they do. Why? Well, they're adapted to this aquatic environment. It's not really aquatic. It's hard to call it a wetland. It is like a vernal pool for a short period of time. A little bit of water. Yes.
Just quick, is that one of the reasons that bees die off?
Yeah, can
And
be.
then when it gets warm, I thought it was heat.
Well, of course, the heat causes it,
Oh, okay.
but yes,
That's
they
what I
can.
think is what did it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, and here it is. Here's the stem up a ways, like up here. Here's the stem down here. Here it has this barrier. Oh, beautifully adapted to growing at this time of year. That's why peas are grown early, because they have this adaptation. Now I want to finish all of this plant part with this. This is what I've been working on lately. This is a fern. This is in right along our driveway. And you can see the water in here every spring, right along the driveways with snow melt and rain. Snow wasn't very good melt this year, but we still had it in it because this was the spring. Okay. Here they start coming up through the water. These are ferns. These are sensitive ferns. Here's what it looks like later in the year. Okay, this can even dry out and they'll live, but then they die back. Then they have their rhizomes underground, but then they come up, and what happens is ferns don't have these kind of ferns don't have this airspace tissue, but around each group of conducting cells, whether up or down, doesn't matter, in the stem or in the leaf here, they have this barrier called the endodermis with its lignified ring around it that controls the way things pass through it. Completely controls it. Now, that's contrasted with this little thing. This is a broken motor glass, so don't worry about it. This is poorly water flowed fern. Okay. Fern, but it's aquatic. And look what it has, and its stems and its leaves look just like this. It has all these big air spaces, the version around here. And this whole thing has this barrier around it. Very different from the other. Only in the aquatic ferns do you find this extensively, but there's lots of airspace. Now, one final thing. The bottom left of the screen is something I did 56 years ago. I was working in a paleobotany lab for a paleobotanist, and I cut up coal balls, chunks of coal, of the base of a tree fern called Ceronius. And the tree fern grew in wetland environments and had around the outside of the trunk what they call a root mantle. And I made sections with funny kinds of knives, massive kinds of blades through coal balls. And look what these roots have in them. Airspace is just like a water lily. Those adaptations to aquatic environments were probably the first ways in which the land plants adapted to land. And these airspaces are created by a combination of cell division and the expansion of cells. I won't get into that. Unlike the deaths of cells. And here they were in the ferns. That's at that time, anyway. Okay, now I want to conclude with two things here. Back in 1859, and I have some. Anybody wants copies of the 1860 version of Darwin's Origin of Species? I have 6 that I'll give away. Okay, right there. They're the 1860 version, but this is the 1850 version here, 1859 version, pardon me. Back then, toward the end of his book, Darwin hypothesized, along with some experimental evidence, for how plants spread themselves from their so-called native environment to non-native environments. In other words, where they invaded, but without human hands. And he did this, he showed what the ability was to compete and under new conditions, but they could be transported by water, including the sea. He showed that plant seeds, some plant seeds could survive for weeks on end in salt water and then germinate on an island or another continent someplace. He showed also the same thing with transport by birds here. And then he also noted the same thing could probably happen with wind and glaciers. Right? So our big conundrum in this modern world is how do plants, along with the things that carry along with them, that viruses, bacteria, fungi, insects, get around? Well, there's another way they get around. This is a map of human migrations. Humans are a migratory species. Period. They're a migratory species. And wherever they go, they take plants with them. And they take them with them in a variety of ways. Some of the most effective ways are by special cases. For example, this book here, let me go to the last slide. Here, this book here, by Keogh on Wardian case. Okay, started in about 1837 or 8. He made cases with glass in them, which cut off most air supply, if not completely, with soil and plants, and got to the place where you could transport them and or their seeds around the world. And then other people made modifications to it, and they were used well into the mid 20th century. But what did they take along with them? See, the people in England wanted these plants from the tropics and other continents. They wanted them badly. Okay? They took a lot of different plants and brought them in, usually small, because these cases weren't usually much larger than this, like that, and like that. Okay, they took them with them in these Wardian cases. His name was Ward. All over the world, to and from England, and then from one place to another, all around the world. And of course, what did they take with them? Insects, especially, but also fungi, bacteria, and viruses. Then another, that's a pretty new book, by the way. It's like 2020 or 2022. And this one on biotic borders by Shinizuka, okay, explains how especially insects were transported this way and other ways around the world, which also led to exclusion of races of people because they were bringing along with them plants like Japanese honeysuckle or the famous cherry trees of Washington, D.C., et cetera, okay, which brought along with them pretty nasty insects, but also a lot of other things, which that book doesn't get into much. So I want to make you aware of some of these other things. This was the part that had the abstract of my first talk on these wetland plants from 1971, okay, with Connie Chesser. Here's a good book on wetlands, which I use a lot for quick pictures. But here's one associated with this building. This is Don Cox's A Naturalist Guide to Wetland Plants. And he was a director here years before Kamal was. And then these two volumes about the aquatic and wetland plants of northeastern North America by Garrett Crowe and Barry Hellquist. You know the name Hellquist? His son teaches here in botany, biology. Okay, these are like the two Bibles of what the wetland plants are like in the northeastern United States. This is a new copy of Darwin's Origins. This is an early one that I happen to have from the same publisher who published his original, John Murray, from London, England. Okay, here, which I'm not going to show you up close. Okay, but that's not an original. Okay, this was the 1890s, but of the original. And then a really great book for getting information on wetlands. This one by Mitch and Gossel. Okay, there. And so I encourage you, if you need a copy of Darwin or want a copy of Darwin, take one. Okay, just remember it's the 1860 version, and the pagination isn't quite the same as what I've shown here on the screen. Yes.
First of all, watercress is that edible? Are there different varieties of watercress?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
it is.
Some of these, I didn't get into some of these things, but some of them are both edible as well as toxic.
Oh, okay. So just don't go.
Have you ever had cattail cookies, for example?
That's all cookies.
Yeah. They're a great source of starch,
Yeah.
a tremendous source of starch. And with that out in these marshes west of here, you can get tremendous quantities of starch. Now, do people do that much? No. The Native Americans figured out how to do that pretty well. They did it with the other species mostly, but they're a great source.
Like the low country, the wetlands of like South Carolina, is there a huge difference in what grows in those kind of areas?
Yes and no. And I didn't, you notice I didn't get into estuaries and marine plants like that. Okay? But some of the inland plants that are freshwater, they can be a lot of the same things. For example, many of these things here that I showed that are native probably grow more commonly in Florida and Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina than they do up here. Up here, they're actually sort of invasive, some of them, not all of them. So, but my point to you with this conundrum bit is that wherever the plants originated is their native land. But even the plants have migrated already from one place to another, where they were invasives, and then after they've been there a while, they become natives. I mean, how do you think all these plants got around the world? And humans, of course. Yes.
But the water chestnuts, it's pulling water chestnuts, say in July or August, is it kind of futile, but they've already, it's doodle pulling.
You can pull them, yes, but and you might pull out the seed or fruit from which they came, but you won't pull out the one which they produce, which is sunk to the bottom.
Right. So
Okay.
their solution.
So they seed when, June?
What's that?
When those plants seed the water chestnuts, when do they actually propagate? In June? or July?
They start in June, usually in July.
Okay, and then, so that's when you need to get rid of them.
Yeah. Well, no, you need to have gotten rid of them by now. You need to get rid of them before they start branching profusely.
Okay.
Oh, because they branch profusely all over. And just go out there now.
So you need to dredge them? Maybe?
I wasn't able to bring up the seed from this, but I pulled this up in the dock in Minetto yesterday. There should be two sets in here. I can't set it. And one had very little to it, the other one has a little more to it. But I wasn't able to pull up the fruit from which the stolen came down here.
Safety first.
Yeah. I hear that.
In times past, believe me, I've been in the water. When I initially started putting together this presentation in April, I had a picture that she took of me in the water down there, taking water chestnuts out, both there at the Minnow dock and as well at the drive-in theater. Because you can walk out there considerable distance.
You get down really deep. I mean, you got, I mean,
Oh, they start off a few inches.
so that's what you need to get them.
You need to get them in May and June.
Yeah.
When the first ones come up in May and then in June.
Yeah.
I've told certain people that.
Sorry.
And then maybe it's round up.
Isn't there some kind of dredging machine that would just go through the bottom of the muck and mud that would?
Yes, but what's the trouble with that? You could destroy a lot of creatures that live in. Karen can tell you, Karen and Kamala, Christian, and others can tell you more. You destroy a lot of creatures.
Yeah.
That's the only problem. However, if you get them early enough and you're careful with your machines, you can pull it up near that, pull out the fruits. But you can't get the fruits out that are not germinated. The seeds that aren't germinated, they're hard to get out. Well, thank you very much.
I want to grab one because I wanted this book for a long time.
After you left, and when we made evolution a required course, I purchased them for every senior student taking evolution.
Wonderful. It's a great,
Paperback copy.
from what I read, it is.
Yeah, and it was easy to do that because the book companies, when you bought them in bulk, like there was 40 or 45 students in a semester, you bought them in bulk, they would reduce the price down to just a couple of dollars. Yes.
This might be quite a tangent to what you've been talking about today, but when you see driving around, like maybe at the Sterling Nature Center where you've got a wetland with a lot of dead trees coming out of it, what's the sort of, is that usually man caused or is that a natural?
Why? Because that wasn't originally a wetland.
Right.
Okay, it was a forested area. For how long, who knows? Yeah, I don't know. Like around along County Route 20, going into the town of Oswego, with all those dead trees in there.
Yeah.
The road helped create that, cut off the stream that flowed through there and made a wetland out of it. And those trees are not adapted to with the roots and stems like these. So boom, they're gone. Now, which trees are? Willows. I had willow up there and then didn't get it. Yes, Mark.
Just a quick question about rhizome. That's, a few years ago, I got, my neighbor had house plants, and I thought, oh, I think they work really well. They grew up with rhizome.
Yeah.
And now, are the rhizomes in the wet, is there a relationship between terrestrial plants that have rhizomes at base versus?
No, they're a little more common in wetland plants. I don't know the exact numbers, but they're much more common in wetland plants. At least from the books that I have.
Yours from our rhizome and some other things.
Yeah.
There's quite a few things.
Quite a few things do.
Right?
Yeah.
And-
Dahlias. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Irises. But look at the iris that I showed you.
Yeah.
Okay. The whole group is characterized by that. And they're characterized by those that grow usually horizontally,
Right.
very neatly so too. Whereas the sedges, rhizomes tend to go down, squeeze around this way a little bit. They're much less extensive, but they branch and then break off and then branch and break off and branch and break off. That's what I've been into for a long time. So I'm still doing it. I'm working on that last plant that I mentioned up there, that sensitive fern now. And I'm having trouble with one part of it. So who knows if I'll get it.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, everybody that came.